On a steel inspection bench in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in the first weeks of 1943, an Army Ordnance inspector picks up a brand new carbine. It is light, it is clean. It looks, in every visible respect, like a finished weapon of war. He works the action, sets it in the test fixture, and fires the proof round, a deliberately overcharged cartridge designed to push the steel to its limit, the way a soldier's life will one day push it to its limit. And the receiver fails. Not a misfeed, not a jam. The receiver, the serialized steel spine of the weapon, the single part that must contain the violence of every shot, cracks under the pressure it was built to survive. The inspector sets it aside. He reaches for the next one, and the one after that. And he keeps reaching, because in this plant, in these months, the failures are not the exception. They are the rule. What makes it almost unbearable is the name stamped into the metal heel of that broken receiver. Because that name, just over a decade earlier, had come within a hair of becoming the standard rifle of the entire United States Army. The name on these failing guns belonged to a man whom John Browning himself, the greatest gunmaker America ever produced, had called the finest firearms designer in the world. The name was Pedersen. This is the story of how the most gifted gun designer of his generation lent his name to a factory that in roughly a year of trying could not deliver a single carbine the Army was willing to accept. And it is the story of what the country did about it, in the middle of a world war, when every weapon counted and there was no time to fail. Before we go further, if you love the forgotten machinery of American history, the decisions, the people, and the hard truths behind the weapons that won the war, take a moment to subscribe. These stories deserve to be remembered, and your support is what keeps them being told. To understand how a name like Pedersen ended up on a pile of rejected steel, you have to understand the weapon itself and the desperate hurry that surrounded it. In 1940, with war already burning across Europe and Asia, the United States Army recognized a gap in its own arsenal. The standard infantry rifle, the M1 Garand, was a magnificent weapon, powerful, accurate, and rugged. But it was also long and heavy, more than 9 pounds of walnut and steel, firing a full-power .30-06 cartridge. For the riflemen at the front, that weight was the price of doing the job. But the modern Army was full of soldiers whose hands were already busy with something else. Machine gun crews hauling their tripods and barrels, mortarmen, radio operators, tank crews, drivers, engineers, artillerymen, forward observers, headquarters staff. For these men, the Garand was simply too much rifle to carry, and the alternative, the .45 caliber pistol, could barely reach across a street. The Army wanted something in between, a light rifle, a carbine, firing a new, smaller .30 caliber cartridge, lighter than the Garands with far more reach than a pistol. Winchester developed the design, and in the autumn of 1941, just weeks before Pearl Harbor, the United States adopted it as the M1 Carbine. Then the world caught fire, and the orders came down to build it, fast. The Chief of Ordnance, Major General Levin Campbell, captured the mood in a single directive. Reports from the jungle theaters, he wrote, made clear that this light, handy little weapon was going to matter enormously. And so, in his words, the greatest possible pressure had to be applied to get carbines and ammunition into soldiers' hands in the minimum possible time. The minimum possible time. That phrase would haunt the men who had to turn it into reality. Because here was the problem. No single factory in America could build 6 million carbines on its own. So the government did something that, in hindsight, looks like a kind of industrial miracle. It scattered the work across the entire economy. The contracts went out not just to established gun makers, but to companies that had never built a firearm in their lives. A maker of jukeboxes, a typewriter company, a postal meter manufacturer, an automobile parts division of General Motors, and, in Grand Rapids, Michigan, a city famous for one thing above all, a furniture manufacturer. This was the arsenal of democracy in its rawest form. Take the ordinary industrial might of America and turn it, almost overnight, toward war. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, it asked men who had spent their careers building chairs and cabinets and cash registers to suddenly hold tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch on a part that, if it failed, could kill the man holding it. Stop and consider the sheer strangeness of it. The company that built the carbines, later famous for arming paratroopers, had until recently been turning out jukeboxes for soda fountains. Typewriter firms, postal meter makers, lamp manufacturers, and dozens of small machine shops with no firearms experience whatsoever were suddenly handed government drawings and told to make weapons of war, and to make them perfectly, by the hundreds of thousands. More than 50 different facilities in the end supplied parts for the carbine. The work traded back and forth between plants like cards in a desperate game. That this system worked at all is one of the quiet miracles of the Second World War. That it occasionally broke down should surprise no one. What is remarkable is not that one factory failed. What is remarkable is how few of them did. Most of them, remarkably, rose to it, but not all. And to understand the one that didn't, we have to meet the man whose name was on the door. John Douglas Pedersen was born in 1881 on the Nebraska plains in the town of Grand Island, and he grew into one of the most quietly brilliant inventors America ever produced. Over a long career, much of it spent with Remington Arms, he earned roughly 69 patents. He designed sporting rifles and shotguns that a sportsman in 1925 would have recognized instantly. The Remington pump guns, the slick little Model 51 pistol. He had a hand in designs whose descendants are still on dealers' shelves today. But Pedersen's reputation rested on something larger than sporting guns. During the First World War, he created one of the most closely guarded secret weapons of the age. A device that could be slipped into a standard bolt-action Springfield rifle and transform it, in seconds, into a rapid-firing semi-automatic. It was so secret, it was given a deliberately misleading name to disguise its purpose. The war ended before it could be used in great numbers, but it cemented Pedersen's standing among the men who understood guns. John Browning, the man behind the 1911 pistol, the bar, the great machine guns, reportedly told a senior Army Ordnance officer that Pedersen was the greatest gun designer in the world. This was not faint praise, and it was not lonely praise. Pedersen's hands had touched some of the most admired sporting arms in America, guns that hunters and shooters trusted without a second thought. His compact Remington Model 51 pistol drew the respect of men who knew firearms intimately. Among them, by several accounts, George Patton himself, who is said to have carried one of Pedersen's pistols. When a designer earns the regard of John Browning on one side and a soldier as exacting as Patton on the other, he is standing at the very summit of his craft. That is the stature of the man whose name was about to be stamped into those failing carbines. Not a pretender, not an opportunist chasing a wartime contract. One of the genuine giants of American gun-making, reaching, in his 60s, for one last chapter. And in the late 1920s and early 1930s, Pedersen came astonishingly close to immortality. When the Army went looking for its first semi-automatic infantry rifle, two designs rose above all others. One belonged to a soft-spoken Canadian-born engineer named John Garand. The other was Pedersen's, an elegant, toggle-locked rifle firing his own .276 cartridge. For years, the trials seesawed between them. There were moments when the Pedersen rifle was the front-runner. In the end, Garand's design won. The .276 cartridge was set aside, and the rifle that went to war as the M1 Garand bore Garand's name, not Pedersen's. So when America entered the Second World War, here was John Pedersen, a legend among gunmakers, a man whose rifle had nearly armed the entire army, now in his 60s, watching another man's design carried into battle. And here, too, was his chance, perhaps his last great chance, to put his name on a weapon that would serve in the war that mattered most. He found his partners in Grand Rapids. The Irwin family, led by Robert W. Irwin, were furniture men, successful, respected, with the factory space and the capital that a wartime contract demanded. Pedersen brought the name and the expertise. Together, in 1942, they formed Irwin-Pedersen, and that spring they secured a contract to manufacture the M1 Carbine. On the surface, it looked like a perfect marriage. Industrial capacity wedded to one of the great minds in American firearms. And then they tried to actually build the gun. Here is the thing about a carbine that looks so simple in a soldier's hands. It is not simple to make. The receiver alone, that serialized steel core, must be machined to exacting dimensions and heat-treated with precise control so that the steel is hard enough to endure tens of thousands of firings, but not so brittle that it shatters. Get the metallurgy wrong, get the machining wrong, let the tolerances drift even slightly, and you do not get a weapon. You get a casting that looks like a weapon and fails like a trap. The receiver is where the whole design lives or dies. It is the part that locks the bolt, channels the gas, absorbs the recoil, and contains the explosion of every single round. There is no margin in it. The heat treatment in particular is a kind of dark art. Heat the steel too little, and it stays soft and wears out. Heat it too much, or cool it wrong, and it turns hard and glassy and snaps under stress. A furniture factory knew wood. It knew joinery and finishing, and the patient craft of building something beautiful. But none of that prepared it for the unforgiving chemistry of hardened ordnance steel, where a flaw you cannot see with the naked eye becomes a crack at the worst possible moment. That is exactly what came out of the Grand Rapids plant. Across roughly a year of production, Irwin-Pedersen turned out fewer than 3,000 carbines, and by the definitive history of the program, not one of them was ever accepted by the Ordnance Department. Not one. The guns came off the line with parts out of specification, and worst of all, with receivers that suffered what the records describe plainly as catastrophic failure. The very heart of the weapon, the part that could not be allowed to fail, was failing. Think about what that meant in human terms. Somewhere in the Pacific, a Marine mortarman or an Army radioman was waiting for a light rifle to defend himself with. The pressure from the top was relentless. Minimum possible time, maximum possible pressure. And here was a plant, bearing the name of the greatest designer in the world, producing weapons that an inspector could destroy on the bench with a single proof round. It would have been so easy, in that climate of desperation, to look the other way, to lower the standard, to tell the inspectors to pass what they could and let the rest sort itself out at the front. The need was real. The shortage was real. Men were waiting, but the Ordnance Department did not look the other way. The inspectors kept rejecting the guns, all of them, because the people running that quality system understood something that the pressure from above could never be allowed to override. A rifle that fails in a factory is a rejected contract, but a rifle that fails in a soldier's hands is a dead soldier. The gun that blows apart on the proof bench is doing exactly what it was supposed to do, failing where no one gets hurt. By the early spring of 1943, the verdict was unavoidable. The Irwin-Pedersen experiment, as a gun-making enterprise, had failed completely. The contract was canceled. The name of the man whom Browning had called the world's finest designer would not, after all, ride into this war stamped on an accepted weapon. And here is where the story turns, where the failure becomes something larger and, in its way, more inspiring than any triumph. The country could not simply walk away from that plant. A whole factory, a whole workforce, a whole building full of tooling and unfinished guns sat in Grand Rapids, and the Army still needed carbines more than ever. So the Ordnance Department turned to a company that had already proven it could do this work, the Saginaw Steering Gear Division of General Motors. Saginaw was, in peacetime, a maker of automobile steering components, but it had thrown itself into war production with extraordinary discipline, already turning out machine guns and, by early 1943, carrying its own large carbine contract at its plant in Saginaw, Michigan. It knew how to hold tolerances, it knew how to run a precision line at scale, and on the 1st of April 1943, Saginaw took over the failed Irwin-Pedersen plant in Grand Rapids. What happened next is the part that ought to be taught in every factory in America. Saginaw sent in its own men, who joined with most of the original Irwin-Pedersen workforce. The same workers, in many cases, who had been turning out the failing guns, and together they completely reconfigured the plant. They brought the methods that had already proven themselves on Saginaw's own line. Rigorous gauging of every critical dimension, tight control over heat treatment, and an inspection regime that caught a bad part before it ever became a finished gun, rather than after. The lesson the new managers carried with them was simple and merciless. You do not inspect quality into a weapon at the end of the line. You build it in at every step, or you do not have it at all. The transformation was not gradual. By the accounts of the men who were there, within 33 days of taking over, the Grand Rapids plant delivered 8,000 carbines beyond what its contract even called for. Finished, accepted, ready for war. Read that again. The same building, largely the same hands. A plant that, a few weeks earlier, had never produced a single acceptable carbine, now running ahead of schedule, ahead of quota, delivering weapons the Army was proud to take. Over the course of 1943, under Saginaw's leadership, that Grand Rapids plant produced more than 220,000 M1 carbines. And the failed guns themselves were not all simply thrown away. Collectors who have studied this history closely estimate that around 2,000 of the rejected Irwin-Pedersen carbines were salvaged, torn down, re-inspected, rebuilt to standard by Saginaw, and finally turned into the serviceable weapons they were always meant to be. The country, in the end, did not waste the steel. It redeemed it. The difference between failure and success, it turned out, was not the workers, and it was not the building, and it was not even the urgency of the war. The difference was the system, the relentless, unglamorous, often invisible discipline of doing the precise work precisely, and of refusing, absolutely refusing, to let a flawed weapon leave the building with a soldier's name waiting on the other end of it. That is the legacy of this strange and largely forgotten episode. The M1 Carbine went on to become the most produced American small arm of the entire war, more than 6 million made, more even than the famous Garand. It served in the snows of the Ardennes and the heat of the Pacific. It went to Korea and to Vietnam after that. Generals carried it. Paratroopers jumped with its folding stock cousin. Rear echelon soldiers who never expected to fire a shot found in it a weapon they could actually carry and use. It earned its place in American history. But that history was built on a foundation most people never see. The foundation of the men who said no. The inspectors who destroyed good-looking guns on the bench because good-looking was not good enough. The managers who canceled a contract bearing a legendary name because a legendary name does not stop a receiver from cracking. The engineers at Saginaw who walked into a building full of failure and, in a single month, turned it into a triumph. As for John Pedersen, the greatest gun designer in the world, he lived until 1951, his name secure in the history of American firearms for the brilliance of his designs, even if the carbine that bore his name never fired a shot in anger under his company's stamp. The irony is almost too perfect. The man whose genius lay in designing guns was undone, this one time, not by design but by the brutal, humbling art of mass production, the art of making the same perfect thing 10,000 times over, without a single failure that matters. And those rejected Irwin-Pedersen carbines? Today they are among the rarest and most prized of all wartime M1 carbines, sought after by collectors precisely because they are the guns that almost weren't. The failures that became, in their way, a monument to how seriously a free country took the lives of its soldiers. Because in the end, that is what the broken receiver on that inspection bench really tells us. Not a story of failure, but a story of a nation that, even in its most desperate hour, with men waiting and the pressure crushing down from the very top, still refused to hand a soldier a weapon it would not stake its own honor on. The greatest designer in the world put his name on those guns, but it was the men who rejected them and the men who rebuilt them who truly won the war. If this story moved you, if you believe these forgotten chapters of American history deserve to be remembered, then subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and ring the bell so you never miss the next one. History like this survives only as long as we keep telling it. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.